All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for our main event, preaching if this was his last sermon. Once again, the pastor from First United Methodist Church in Waterloo. Give it up for Pastor Nate Nims.
So, in getting ready for this, what I was thinking was less what I would say and more what I hope people would remember from everything else I've said. And what that comes down to is the faith that God has in us and the trust that God has in you. And so we're going to look tonight throughout the scriptures and see what God says about you and what God really says about us. So I want to start in Mark chapter 2. Early in the Gospel of Mark, they write, Jesus went through the wheat fields on the Sabbath. As the disciples made their way, they were plucking the heads of wheat. The Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the Sabbath law?" Jesus said to them, "Haven't you read what David did when he was in need, and when he and those with him were hungry? During that time when Abiathar was the high priest, David went into God's house and ate the bread of presence, which only the priests are allowed to eat. And David also gave bread to those who are with him." So in this scene, Jesus and his friends, they're out for a walk on the Sabbath, and the disciples, they start to get a little hungry, so they're walking through this field, and they pick some wheat from the stalk. And the Pharisees, they come along, and they see the disciples doing this, and they treat the disciples like kids that have their hand in a cookie jar, right? Like they make this big deal out of it. These Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, they come along to the disciples and say, like, you know the rules, and you're breaking them. You have to be chastised for that. You have to be shamed for that. You're not doing things the right way. You're sinners, so stop it. The disciples, they feel like I often felt when after school my older sister would catch me eating extra snacks, right? Like she would come in and say, "I'm going to call Mom, you're in trouble." And I would just like shrink down because I knew I was actually in trouble, right? Like we have these moments where we feel shamed and lost. And I mean, not only are the disciples ashamed here, they're ashamed essentially for eating cereal without milk, right? Like if you're going to get in trouble for something interesting and worthwhile, right? Like if you're going to be shamed for something, make it worth your time. But what interests me in this passage is how Jesus responds, because he says to the Pharisees, "Haven't you read what David did when he was in need and with those that were with him when he was hungry?" There's two reasons I really, really love Jesus. One is that he's funny, and the second is that he calls people out. So he says to these Pharisees, whose job it is to read and interpret the law, the Bible, the scriptures, he says to these religious leaders that read the Bible every day, "Have you ever read the Bible? Have you ever read the stories of David and what he did?" Like he calls them out. Jesus says to the people that read the Bible every day, "Do you really know what you're reading?" And those David stories, like they aren't minor in the Old Testament, right? They're kind of a big deal. David is important, and the stories of David are big. And in this story of David, he was hungry, and he wanders into a temple, and there was this bread of presence, this showbread that was set aside only for the priest. It wasn't David's to eat, but he was hungry, he was in need, and so this bread was given to him. And then he shared this gift with others. Even though he didn't deserve this holy meal, he was gifted it and told it's okay. So Jesus asked the Pharisees, like, clearly you know this story. And if you know this, why are you still stuck in this narrow, judgmental mindset? Have you no grace left within you? Is there no room in your heart? These Pharisees seem to forget again and again that it's not grace when we deserve it. It's grace when we have no other options. And there's this grace that comes, and Jesus shows them that you might have laws and traditions, but love will win. So in this story in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus compares himself to David, saying if God wasn't angry then, God clearly isn't angry now. It's okay. So Jesus compares himself to David, but David fed his friends. So the disciples are compared to David's friends. So we should ask ourselves, well, how did David talk about his friends? So it's in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, we read about some of David's friends. And it's written, these are the commanders of David's warriors. And that sounds a bit more impressive than companions, right? Like Chronicles makes it a big deal. So they helped to continue to support him while he was king. Together with all Israel, they made him king as the Lord had promised. This is the list of David's warriors. Jashobeam the Hakmonite, which is just, if anyone is looking for a kid's name, there you go, right? Like, if you're going to be a mighty warrior, have a name that sounds like it, because I'm sure that Bill and HR and Karen from accounting are really nice people, but they need a nickname if they're going to be epic and mighty, right? So Jashobeam the Hakmonite is one of David's mighty friends. He was the commander of the 30. He raised a spear against 800, killing them in a single occasion. Next came Eleazar, Dodo's son, the Ahohite. Again, another really cool name, right? He was one of those warriors. He was with David at Pasdammim. And you all remember the Pasdammim story, don't you? Right? That was better than Avengers 4 that hasn't come out yet, but will hopefully soon. Right? They're telling all these epic, amazing stories. And then 1 Chronicles continues. There was Benaniah, Jedahiah's son of Chazabel, a hero who performed many great deeds. He killed 2 of Moab's leaders. And on a snowy day, he went down into a pit and killed a lion. Yeah. Like, I don't know when you've been lion hunting, but it's a lot harder to hunt a lion on a snowy day. And do you know what happens when you hunt a lion? Like, what are you going to do with all that? You give your partner a matching set of shoes for their purse, right? So, Merry Christmas to someone. But they continue. There are all these, in 1 Chronicles, these epic tales of David's friends, these mighty warriors, and they do things looking back on them. They are barbaric stories. They are violent stories, but they read them back then like they were the Justice League. They read them like they were the new Aquaman movie coming out. They were these epic tales that reminded us of how we can do amazing things. So Jesus and the disciples, they're just walking through this field, enjoying the day. They eat some grain because they're hungry, and the Pharisees try to shame them, saying, no, you can't do that. But Jesus says, just calm down. There is grace here. And these friends of mine, they're like David's mighty warriors. They are doing great things. Jesus says to them, they're not just good, they're epic. He talks about his friends in this amazing way that says we might have these rules, we might have these traditions, but more than that, we should never use these scriptures to beat one another down. It's all about how we can lift each other up and be who God says we are. Because too often, the Christian story, as it's told, begins with depravity and sin and loss and emptiness and pain. But that is not where God begins. Has anyone ever thought about the phrase original sin? It's a weird kind of phrase. Like, we use it to talk about how we're all born with either a God-shaped hole or some stain of sin within us. But how many of us have ever really sinned in an original way? Right? Like, if you poke somebody's eye out with a beaver, that is a very original sin. But, like, saying a white lie, not that original anymore. Right? So, it's a weird kind of phrase. Original sin, as it may be, that's not where the Bible starts, though. The Bible starts with joy and celebration. So in Genesis, in chapter 1, this story and this poetry unfolds where God creates and then God calls something good. God creates and then something is good. And God creates humanity. And then God says, this is very good. Everything in this opening passage of Genesis is goodness and joy and pleasure and grace. the Bible begins with God saying, you are good. And if we miss that, we miss the rest of the story too. If we fail there, we can't take our faith any further. It's in the Gospel of John in chapter 14 that Jesus says, I assure you that whoever believes in me will do the works that I do. They will do even greater works than these because I am going to the Father. Jesus says, you can do what I do, and you'll do even more too. Jesus tells us, you can do this. I trust you. You will be amazing, and you are more than you imagine. But if we beat ourselves up all the time, if we just call ourselves sinners that are lost in the hands of an angry God, if we just see ourselves as depraved, how can we see ourselves as what Jesus says we are? Jesus says you are one of his epic friends. We have to be careful with Jesus because he will pull greatness out of you. He will inspire you to do what he's done and more. So in Exodus 19, it's just before the 10 Commandments are given. There's this covenant agreement that mirrors a lot of the Jewish wedding ceremony. And if you have questions about that, talk to Matt or Scott, because they can tell you all about that, and I don't have time for it tonight. But there's this whole story in Exodus of how the giving of the 10 Commandments are a marriage ceremony. It's about how God is saying, this is how we will live together. This is our relationship. This is our covenant. This is our promise. Because God has always been looking for partners that will reflect goodness and joy. God has always been looking for people that will seek justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. God has always been looking for people to do this work with. And in Exodus 19, verse 5, God says, if you faithfully obey me and stay true to my covenant, you will be my most precious possession out of all the peoples, since the whole earth belongs to me. So when we live into this flow of grace and justice and joy, when we are people that witness to the love of God, we show others the divine. We are all called. You are called to be this witness to grace and peace because God trusts and God knows that you can do it. God doesn't think you are a tragic guest of your own existence. God thinks you are pretty special. God knows you can do this, and God has trusted you to do it. You are never cast aside. You are holy and loved. It's in 1 Peter that they write something that echoes those words from Exodus, saying, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people who are God's own possession. You have become this people so that you may speak of the wonderful acts of the one who called you out of darkness into God's amazing light. Once you were no people, but now you are God's people. Once you hadn't received mercy, but now you have received mercy. It's this promise, this claim that you are here to live into that holy responsibility, to be these holy people. And that matters because when you hear church, what do you think? Right? Like when you hear church, do you think of revolutionaries that are changing the world? When you hear church, do you think of a holy calling that inspires the best of you to change the world? When you hear church finance meeting, do you think that is where the action is? Or when you hear church, do you think, oh, that's a nice thing that I do a couple times a week because I've been told my whole life that's a nice thing I should do a couple times a week? God is calling you to more because God thinks you are so much more than we often think we are ourselves. God wants the best of us because God believes in the best of us. So just after the 10 Commandments are given in Exodus 20, it's written that the people shook with fear and stood at a distance. They said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us or we will die. And And Moses says to them, don't be afraid. The people are standing at a distance, and how many times are we standing at a distance from ourselves, from one another, from God, because we're afraid to trust what God trusts in us? Jesus compares his disciples who lied, who cheated, who betrayed, who stole, who were shamed, who were lost, who didn't always know what to do, who didn't trust themselves as much as Jesus trusted them. Jesus says, these guys who are eating grape nuts without milk are amazing. Don't shame them. But how shamed are we often feeling ourselves? Because we don't trust that Jesus really believes in us, that God trusts us. And when God sees us, God says, you are very good. Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So my guess is, one way or another, we came here feeling like we were meek or mournful or maybe not worthy of this holy calling. But we all, no matter what, came here loved. Jesus says you can do this. Jesus says you are blessed. So how far are you going to take that blessing? If God believes in you and God trusts you, will you trust yourself? Will you believe in one another? Will you step into this holy calling that God has placed on your life? Because we can stand at a distance. We can step back and be afraid, or we can remember that God says, you're good. You're very good. You'll do amazing things, and I'll always be with you. I don't think I'm the most tattooed pastor in the conference anymore. Andrew Bardole probably has me beat. He's down in Corning, Iowa. But one of my favorite tattoos is Eucharist on the inside of my arm there. It's one of my newer ones too. And Eucharist, it's used in the Gospel of Luke when Jesus is sharing the Last Supper. And it's two words that are put together. So EU is good, and Charist means gift or grace, depending on how you want to translate it. So in this meal, Jesus takes bread, breaks it, gives thanks to God, shares it with his disciples, and says, do this in remembrance of me. And then Christ takes the cup, gives thanks to God, shares it with the disciples, and says, drink of this, all of you, for the forgiveness of sins. Christ breaks himself open and pours himself out, and then invites us to do the same, so that we might break our hearts open just as God's heart is open, that we might pour ourselves out and trust that in giving ourselves to others, God will put everything back together with grace. I put that there as a reminder. And maybe you don't need a tattoo to remember things, but I do. I put that there as a reminder that God trusts me to do this work. And if God trusts me, God definitely trusts you. Because I know what I've done. And it is more original sins than eating grape nuts. Right? Like I have done far worse things than plucking grain on the Sabbath. But Jesus trusts those disciples and says they will do amazing things. He says you will do amazing things because God believes in you. God loves you. God made you very good. So if the last thing you ever hear is God believes in you, may you live like that is all you ever need to know. Because Jesus came so that you might know God and that you can trust the God that trusts in you. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Pastor Nate Nims. Can't think of a better way to close the season. That is the end of the season. We now get to enter into a wonderful time of Christmas season, a time of giving, a time of reflection. And as you go forth into that season, may you take Nate's words with you, and may you realize just how much God trusts you and loves you. The entire time he was speaking, I kept thinking of that phrase, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And normally when I hear those words, I think of it as the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated, as a way to just love your neighbor. Listening to Nate talk tonight, love your neighbor and yourself. For God loves all of us so much that if you learn how to love yourself, that helps you love your neighbor. If you realize how special and wonderful you are, it helps you see the wonder and specialness of the person sitting next to you or across from you. So go forth knowing that God views us as masterpieces. We are created exactly how he wanted us to be created. We are not trash. We are not to wallow in sin or shame or regret. We are to rejoice that we are children of God. So take that love with you. Have a Merry Christmas, and I cannot wait to see you guys next year. And as you go forth, realize Christ loves you and use that to be Christ for one another. Thank you, and have a great season, guys.